Last time, we discussed the ways in which babies are not tabula rasa creatures, but rather come fully equipped with all sorts of innate skills that facilitate learning. In this lecture, as we move into specific types of learning, we'll begin with language. We'll start by considering how babies pull off one of the most impressive feats of learning around, at least in my view. And we'll see that, as in the last lecture, again, babies are not a tabula rasa. At birth, babies don't even have the vocal capacity to generate most human sounds. By 2, they are capable of understanding and communicating using a rather large swath of words and phrases. By 5, they can tell simple stories. And by adolescence, they could tell their parents many complex things, if they felt like it, which they often don't. Now, all of this learning appears to just unfold as though there were a program in the brain. How does that happen? I want to make several points in this lecture. First, learning your first language is learning. Second, first language learning relies on some innate assumptions and capacities that infants and children bring to that task. And third, the consequences of that first language may be greater than you think, because those consequences include the fact that learning your native tongue also means you are losing some capabilities along the way. To the first point, what does it mean to learn a language? Mastery of language requires a lot of different and more specific capacities. For example, you need to be able to segment a stream of sounds and pauses into meaningful units, recognizing boundaries between words and integrating sounds that are uttered together into words. You have to know the lexicon, the vocabulary, and what it refers to. You have to know the rules for combining words, the grammar, and you have to be able to use those rules to make new sentences that can be understood by others. You also have to know how the language is to be used, the rules of communicating, how you show that you want to turn to talk, how to wait for a pause to begin your contribution, how different words can have more than one meaning. Despite how crazily complex this all sounds, learning your native tongue feels, at least in retrospect, effortless and automatic. You're doing much of what I said in that complex list right now, as you hear my voice, and it probably feels more or less easy to do. So how do babies actually learn to talk and to listen? Initial ideas about this were actually grounded in those behaviorist theories about learning. Remember those old ideas about associative learning and operant conditioning? So the idea was that we learn to speak through rewards and punishments. Well, this obviously didn't work out well because it doesn't explain much about language. The next big idea involved a concept called universal grammar, and this concept was proposed by Noam Chomsky, and it's been at the heart of most of the work on language acquisition by infants in the past decades. The basic idea behind universal grammar is that babies are born with a kind of implicit knowledge of some deep and basic principles or rules of language. What happens in early childhood then, according to the idea of a universal grammar, is that kids tune this basic structure to the specifics of their own language, but they aren't really learning anything per se. Rather, they're tuning an already present, full-blown language capacity. Now, the good thing about universal grammar is that it explains some things that learning theory didn't. The problem with this idea is that studies of human languages are making it harder and harder to keep around this idea that there are fundamental, universal properties of all known languages. And in fact, more recent work actually suggests there's no real universal grammar. There's just too much variability in human languages. Rather, there are some general learning mechanisms that are present at birth, and those permit babies to take all this language to which they're exposed and to make out of it a native tongue. In this lecture, we'll consider what those mechanisms might be and how they work to help us to go from no words to about 60,000 words, along with complex knowledge of syntax and grammar by adulthood. To begin, let's consider how we learn words. If you plotted a graph of vocabulary development over early childhood, you'd see something like the following: a kind of slow start in infancy, followed by a huge spurt into toddlerhood, a spurt that involves learning more than a word a day, and which continues into adulthood. How can this happen? The rate is absolutely amazing. So how do we start, and how do we go so fast? Well, how we start begins with phonology. Phonology is the sound structure that languages have. And the important element for sounds in language is contrast. Dog is not bog, and dog is dog, no matter how loudly we say it. And it's those phonetic distinctions that make us know whether someone is telling about their pet or about an undesirable encounter with swampy ground. Now, work by a number of researchers shows that very young infants are already learning phonemes, the basic sound units of their native language. And babies use a kind of bootstrapping technique to figure out how words sound in their native language. What they do is, from listening to speech around them, they figure out some basic rules for deciding where words start and end. And those rules are based on repeated patterns in the speech streams that they hear. From those basic rules, they begin to divide up speech streams into sound units, and they actually do this before they know what words mean. Once they have some words, they then use those words and the patterns those words come with to figure out some additional words. So this process is often called bootstrapping. It means working with the little pieces you do know to figure out the things you don't yet know. Now, in English, first of all, some sounds tend to occur together in words, and other sounds almost never occur together within a single word. So the statistical probability that a syllable will be followed by another syllable are something babies and adults can monitor very well, both in language and in non-linguistic sound streams like music or just computer-generated noises. Because languages are not random, the probability of certain kinds of transitions of sounds within a word is quite high, and the probability of transitions between words is lower. And this is because one word can be followed by many possible words involving many possible sounds, but within a word, one sound has only a smaller set of possible following events or sounds. Another thing about English is that there are also some distinct stress intonation patterns. My father used to say that sometimes we put the emphasis on the wrong syllable. In English, our words tend to stress the first syllable. And this regularity also helps babies decipher the beginnings of words. Intonation and pitch also help babies distinguish word boundaries, and we tend to talk differently to babies. We use a kind of speech that's often called motherese, and it exaggerates word boundaries and other features of our language for babies to make sure that they can see, hear, and experience those boundaries. Now, here's the central problem, though, for examining the process by which babies learn words. Babies can't talk, and it actually takes a while before their larynx and tongue and vocal apparatus even come close to adult function. So how can we know whether a baby knows a word before the baby can speak that word? And to answer this, I want to tell you about a clever set of studies by Dan Swingley and Richard Aslin. In their studies, babies look at pairs of pictures, and they hear words that actually go with only one of the pictures. And they look at how much time the baby spends looking at the correct picture, the picture that corresponds to the word the baby's hearing. Now, what they were able to show is that by 18 months, babies are actually already showing that they know words because they're looking at the right picture when they hear the word. But you can ask how good or how accurate is a baby's phonological understanding of that word. And to test this, Swingley and Aslin provided babies with subtly mispronounced versions of words. So they might say opple or tog or baby instead of apple, dog, and baby. Now these are subtle mispronunciations, but They're linguistically meaningful. None of you listening to this tape heard the mispronunciations and thought they were the words apple, dog, and baby. It turns out even 15-month-old babies behave differently with the mispronunciations as compared with the correct pronunciations. And some evidence suggests this is already evident by 6 months of age. So way before babies can talk, they're already learning the correct sounds of words, and they're linking those words to images. Now, babies are unlikely to be actively trying to figure these things out in the way that adults might. Rather, their learning of language is incidental to the task of trying to understand what's happening around them. It is really interesting that this capacity to extract words from speech streams is preserved in adults. Jennifer Safran and her colleagues played a 20-minute tape of phony speech sounds from a fake language system to adults and children who were asked to engage in a coloring task. So the adults and children are sitting there and coloring, and in the background is this tape of phony speech sounds. And the speech sound tape lacked gaps between words, and the only cues to word boundaries were those statistical transition probabilities. That is, words were composed of sounds that had a high transition probability. And in normal English, what that means is that words are consisting of sounds that almost always occur together. Non-words in this phony speech stream were sounds that wouldn't occur together. Now, after the coloring task, adults and children were asked to listen to sets of sounds on tape, and they were asked to indicate which set of sounds was more like the tape they'd been hearing in the background. Now, both sets of sounds they heard were actually from that tape, but one set was comprised of sounds that would have made up words. The other set would have been non-words, based again on those transition probabilities. Both adults and 6 to 7-year-old children were able to do better than chance at this task, despite the fact that the tape played only once, only for 20 minutes, and only in the background while they were actually engaged in a different task. In other words, both adults and children were sensitive to the statistical probabilities of the tape they had heard, and in particular to the statistical properties that indicated word boundaries. So the innate ability to track transition probabilities in sounds, combined with exposure to one's own native language, makes it possible for babies to figure out words from very early in their lives. Now, by high school, kids know 30,000 to 50,000 words. Once children begin to acquire and produce words, their vocabulary size literally explodes. So a second question is, how can children acquire new words so quickly? Now, one piece of this puzzle is what we've just been talking about. They build a basis of words from phonetic bootstrapping, if you will, and then it becomes easier for them to acquire additional words. However, young children's word acquisition is so fast, sometimes involving only a single exposure to a word, that other explanations are needed. And as with the phonetics rules, like first syllable stress patterns, these often consist of biases in interpreting new words, and in particular, biases that reduce the number of possible meanings that the word could have. Some of the biases are social. Infants use gesture and eye gaze from speakers to help decode what a word is referring to. It's worth mentioning that this reliance on a speaker's gestures or eye gaze is absolutely connected to the kinds of social, cooperative, and understanding of others orientation that we talked about in the last lecture. Now, another bias is not social, but it involves the assumption that new words refer to whole objects. So if an adult labels an object for the child assumes the label refers to the object rather than its parts. But then how do we learn labels for parts? A further assumption kids may use is referred to as mutual exclusivity. And this is the assumption that objects have one label only. So if a known object is given a new label, the new label must refer to some part of the object. In one example study, Mikkel Hansen and Ellen Markman showed young kids an object, either a familiar hat, which they presumed most kids would have seen before, or an unfamiliar tea strainer, an object the kids had not seen. 2 to 3-year-old children, who were in the midst of what is called a vocabulary explosion, were shown the object, and the experimenter then introduced them to a new word, brim or mesh. Now, in both cases, the experimenter traced the relevant part of the object while saying the new word. So the experimenter would trace the brim of the hat while saying brim. And afterwards, kids were asked to identify what the word referred to. Now, if kids only needed social cues to determine whether a word was a part or whole object reference, the tracing should suffice. But if kids need to also assume mutual exclusivity, then they should get this task correct for the hat, because they know hat refers to the whole object, and they can then assume brim must be a part. But they should get it wrong for the tea strainer, where they're encountering the object for the first time. They hadn't learned tea strainer, and so they can't be sure if the object they were looking at was a mesh or not. And in fact, this is exactly what happened. Children needed both a gesture from the adult, they needed that tracing gesture, but they also needed mutual exclusivity to learn the new word for parts of an object. Constraints like mutual exclusivity, along with capitalizing on social understanding, let kids acquire words very rapidly over childhood. Now, there are differences between kids in this process, and those differences are related to how much parent-child language interaction there is. Kids learn more words in speech-heavy, high-vocabulary households than in households that are more taciturn or which use smaller vocabularies. And in later childhood and adulthood, vocabulary acquisition is also related to reading habits. But that's just a lexicon. That's the collection of words. It's the vocabulary. Part of being a native speaker also means understanding the rules of grammar in ways that let us generate new sentences and understand the difference between dog bites man and man bites dog. These rules of order are at the heart of grammar, and to study this process, people sometimes look at the acquisition or the learning of a false, simplified grammar. So for example, babies might be presented with syllables like ga and ti. And these syllables can be organized into threesomes that follow different sequences. For example, ga ti ga. Then infants get tested with new syllables, such as wo and fe, organized into either a familiar pattern, so for those who saw ga ti ga, they would see wo fe wo, or organized into a dissimilar pattern, wo fe fe. It turns out infants learn the rules for putting different proto-words together very easily. And they can learn them for language-like stimuli like wo fe fe and ga ti ga, but they can also learn these rules for non-linguistic stimuli. For example, they can learn rules of order for how you might array pictures of dog breeds. So far, we've seen how babies begin with a very few general inborn capacities, like being able to monitor statistical frequencies in a sound stream, being able to extract some initial words and understandings of order rules, and being able to use those minimal rules and initial words to identify and learn additional words and rules. Now, this process is believed to be largely incidental. That is, babies don't sit around deliberately trying to learn a grammar or a new vocabulary. And it's also powerful. It goes from 0 to 60,000 in under 2 decades. The contrast with learning a language in later childhood or adulthood, which we'll consider next time, is profound. We often experience second language learning in adulthood as effortful, as requiring intention and deliberate learning of vocabulary, and the end result is usually far short of native fluency and native lexicon size. Now, to some extent, this difference is partly due to the losses that learning our first language involves. Losses, you say? But yes, we often think of learning as a purely gain-oriented experience. But learning changes us, and sometimes the changes involve losses as well as gains. And language is a particularly useful and interesting place to pause and to consider the losses. So what are those losses? Well, first of all, at birth, babies have an amazing capability to distinguish between different sounds. And in fact, at birth, babies can distinguish between all the known sounds in human languages, including some of the clicks and unusual phonemes that you may have seen only on a National Geographic episode. Now, unfortunately, this early linguistic brilliance gives way quickly to a more tuned and focused competence. So in tests of this, a baby would sit on a parent's lap and face an experimenter, and the experimenter sort of shows the baby toys, and this keeps the baby paying attention. Now, while this is happening, the baby hears a series of phonemes, sound units, repeated over and over. For example, ta, 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 ta. And what happens is that the baby gets taught to turn his or her head when the sound changes, at which point the baby gets to see a new bunch of toy animals moving around in a display. This is a really nice little reward for babies, so they're very happy to do this kind of task. Now, in one study, Worker and Desjardins looked at whether young babies and adults, native English speakers, could distinguish between two t sounds that are irrelevant to English, that for English speakers kind of seem the same and don't mark any important word distinctions, but which in Hindi mark very important word contrasts. Now, the two T sounds in Hindi can be made as follows for those of you who are standard English speakers. For the standard English T, English speakers put their tongue on the ridge behind their front teeth and say T. In Hindi, one T is made by putting the tongue on the roof of the mouth and the other by putting the tongue against the front teeth. So if you try this out, your mouth will feel different as you try to make a T sound. And a Hindi speaker will hear a different sound. You may or may not be able to hear a difference. Both ways of saying T will sound like T. Infants between the ages of 6 and 8 months actually hear the difference in these three T sounds very well. In that experimental setup that I just described, they turn their head when the way the speaker is making the T changes. But adult English speakers are actually pretty bad at doing this. They don't turn their heads or do the equivalent. They can't hear those sounds as being different. And these losses in the ability to tell the difference in different sounds are actually evident already by 12 months of age. For infants who are learning English and living in North America, but who are also exposed to Hindi in their homes, the distinction remains. Now, these phonetic losses are important because they help tune the brain for the native language. When an infant is potentially growing up bilingual, the brain is tuning for two languages right from the get-go. Phonetic losses are not all that's lost with first language acquisition. More conceptual losses also occur. And this is because languages have an important role in marking which conceptual distinctions matter in the worlds we live in. For example, in Korean, language marks a difference between the tight and loose fits of one object into another. But this is not a difference we mark in language in English. Now, we can understand this distinction between a tight and a loose fit immediately when I describe it. It's part of that understanding of physical properties of objects that we seem to share with many other species and with which we're born. However, after we learn our native language, Elizabeth Spelke and her colleagues speculated that, as with phonemes, we might become less sensitive to the differences that our languages treat as less important. Spelke and her team used habituation paradigms, and they showed infants and adults a series of actions and objects that could be categorized as tight or loose-fitting. So one set of objects might consist of a set of tubes with one tube inserted into another, and some pairs of tubes might be tight while others would be more loose. After being shown a series of images that represent tight fits, if babies dishabituate to a new scene involving loose fits, it means they view it as being in a different category compared to those they've been looking at. And 5-month-old infants readily made this distinction of loose versus tight-fitting object relationships. By contrast, English-speaking adults do not make this distinction spontaneously when asked to categorize images. They actually ignore the tight versus loose fit dimension. Now, because adults can make this distinction when it's pointed out to them, Spelke and her colleagues believe that what language does at the conceptual level is not to eliminate sensitivity, but to diminish or enhance it. And this brings me to the largest issue of all with respect to language acquisition. Does our first language end up shaping the way we think? One of the prominent current researchers in this area is Lera Boroditsky. Boroditsky has suggested that some of the most fundamental aspects of human experience involve our experiences of time and space. These are crucial categories that affect how we divide up the world into past, present, and future, and into here versus there and near versus far. Now, language is used to represent, think about, and to communicate about space and time. And Boroditsky argues this has some important implications for how we think. and via an extension I'll make about her work, what we can and cannot learn easily. Now, in much of Boroditsky's work, she looks at how different language-speaking communities think about space and time. For example, she has worked in Northern Australia with Aboriginal communities, and in those communities, she can ask a 5-year-old girl to point north, and that girl will be able to do so accurately and immediately, no matter where she is or whether she can see the sky. Now, most of us outside that community, well-educated researchers, are not able to do so at all. And in fact, Boroditsky occasionally enjoys herself at presentations by trying it out on her audiences. Now, Boroditsky argues that the reason for this is that that girl's language has a very particular compass-oriented way of talking about relationships in space. That is, rather than left, right, in front of, behind, and so on, the way we might talk about relationships in space, speakers of Kuktayur locate objects in cardinal directions. Cups are northwest of plates, or the guy to the west of Joe is his uncle. Does this matter? Well, as Boroditsky points out, first of all, you can't even talk about things in this language without staying oriented to where north is. And then it may be less surprising to learn that people who speak such languages are very good at knowing where they are, even inside buildings they don't know or in unfamiliar environments. It's probable, in my view, that this type of absolute orientation might help people learn a new spatial environment more quickly, because the model that they're building from is less egocentric. It's less to do with relative to their own position, and it has more to do with their surroundings than themselves. And it may be a more flexible approach to building a model of your surroundings. Languages differ in a vast array of ways, including in how they represent number. For example, some languages offer better grounds for learning numbers and base 10 arithmetic than others. Some languages, like Tamil, may offer better clarity about place value because of the way that numbers are represented in that language. In fact, even German may offer better place value insight than English because it amounts to representing 21 as 1 and 20 rather than the English 21. So, just as your native language is an enormous, impressive achievement of learning done almost with no effort at all, your native language is also an arena of tuning your mind to distinctions and concepts that are deemed important by your culture. And that tuning entails some losses as well. Now, those losses are perhaps nowhere better evident than when we look at the acquisition of a second language, which we will do in the next lecture.